Is it doing it?
We in the illusion of motion? Or illusion of
space first.
Space.
10 and then 11.
Okay.
So let me.
Shape, yeah. Okay.
Just going to hide all this and go ahead and open up Keynote.
That web assignment was really fun. I spent 7 hours on it.
Really?
Yeah, it was pretty intense. The guy that I did the tutorial with, he had you make patterns and all kinds of stuff. It was really, really fun.
Wow, you'll have to show us once we finish here. That'd be great.
I'll probably post it today as soon as I get all the wording done, explaining it. But I finished it last night about 10 o'clock.
Oh my gosh.
It was fun though. I learned so much.
Oh, good.
There's about 50 layers in it.
Oh my gosh. I can't wait to see the link to the tutorial you chose. But.
Yeah.
All right, well, here we are. It is July 18th, and we're going to talk about the illusion of space and the illusion of motion and how people working in a two-dimensional workspace can add those two things. So as people who live in the real world, we're very familiar with three-dimensional space. When we go look at three-dimensional art, we understand that we can see it from many different vantage points. We can walk around it, we can turn it over if it's something portable, and we see it on many different facets, from many different facets. Two-dimensional art, however, like drawings and screen art, websites, which are basically flat, many times artists want to create the illusion of space or depth in that flat space. And that flat space, the two-dimensional space, is known in the art world as the picture plane. There are a number of different ways that you can show depth. Here is a list. You can start with the size of things. We're going to go over all of these things briefly, but overlapping, vertical location in the picture plane, aerial perspective, plan and elevation, linear perspective, 1-point, 2-point, multi-point perspective. If you've taken any art classes, you're probably familiar with these terms. Amplified and multiple perspective, isometric, open form, closed form, and transparency. Here we have a photograph. So it's not only things that you create yourself, but it can be how you compose or crop a photograph. And I'm sure that some of you already know what's going on in this photograph. We have a very good example of changing of size of objects as they get farther away from us. We also see aerial perspective where things get a little less saturated with color and a little less distinct the further they are from us. And those are some of the ways that this photograph shows us depth and distance. So we just instinctively read large objects as being closer to us because we know that when we look out onto the world, as things get farther away from us, they tend to look smaller. So size is the easiest thing to use to establish a sense of space in your composition. It does work best with similar objects as we see here in this example, the figures. We have the larger ones down near the bottom, and then the smaller ones as we go up through the picture. And our mind says, oh, those must be farther away than these ones near the bottom, which we read as being in the foreground. So to use this in your own work, you would repeat the same object, basic object. You know, there are differences in the figures on this painting, but basically they're all recognizable as a figure. So they're repeated while decreasing the size. You may or may not have a vanishing point, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It also works with abstract shapes. Again, it works best if you use similar shapes. If you had a bunch of circles and triangles and octagons in this example, it may not read as well. But since they're basically all rectangular shapes, we get a sense that there are objects in the foreground and objects further away from us. You can use exaggerated size. So relative sizes give you a sense of depth and space. You can use an exaggerated size to put a lot of emphasis on any particular object. So in this example, we've got a very large circus performer. It's actually sticking out of the picture plane, so one hand and both legs extend beyond the picture. And so the feeling is that this is very, very close. The other objects are quite small in comparison, and they read as being in the background and quite far away. So this gives you, without a lot of variation in color or even shapes, it gives you a lot of visual interest and a sense of some pattern inside your piece. Another technique for establishing space, or the illusion of space, is overlapping. It's another very simple. Each shape hides part of another shape, and it can be used with objects of the same size as we see here. So there's overlapping going on, which does get a sense of depth. But if you combine it with size, things are getting smaller as they get farther away, it becomes even more effective. So in this drawing, excuse me. Oops. I don't know how to stop that. Hopefully that stopped it. There. In this picture, in this drawing, the artist is more interested in the shapes and how they're interacting with each other than creating a very realistic drawing or painting. Sorry, it's squash. Another technique is vertical location. So this was used a lot in older art, Asian art, Middle Eastern art, where the elevation on the picture plane indicates how far away it is. If you're higher up in the picture plane, that object or scene or thing was farther away. And then objects that are lower in the picture are considered closer. And I'm sure looking back through the examples that we've seen so far, you can see that a lot of times these techniques are combined. So we're kind of pulling them out and looking at them individually, but many times they are combined. You can emphasize both figures and objects with vertical location. This doesn't use size so much as just vertical location, and the artist is using this to call more attention to the objects themselves instead of trying to create, again, a realistic picture. But still, even though there isn't a lot of attention paid to size and things like aerial perspective, our mind still reads this as a table with a ham that is in front of the camera and the apples are behind the table on a windowsill. So it's funny, and it's kind of good sometimes to just look at this and realize that your brain is interpreting this strictly flat object as something that has some dimension. So aerial perspective is using color and detail and value to create depth. So as in this picture of Yosemite, as things get farther away, they become less distinct. If you go outside and the smoke isn't covering the mountains, you can see that the closer foothills or the closer edges of the mountains have a lot of color variation and a lot of detail, but as they get farther and farther away, it turns sort of a bluish gray. Contours get a little less distinct, edges are a little less clear, and there's less contrast. Here's an example of aerial perspective used in a painting. A lot of color, a lot of contrast in the foreground, and as you go up on the two-dimensional picture frame, there's a little less contrast, a little less detail, and we interpret that as being mountains in the background. In architecture, there's three kinds of drawings that you can use to communicate your plans, your ideas to a client. And here in your book, there's a great example by Frank Lloyd Wright. Those three types of drawings are plan, elevation, and perspective. And you need all three of them in order to tell the whole story to the client. So in this example, there's the plan, which sort of takes the idea that the architect is drawing out and creates a flat cutaway. So as you can see the sizes of the rooms and the placements of the doors and windows and things like that. Then there's an elevation drawing, which shows you what this is going to look like in comparison to the land. And then there's a perspective drawing, which shows you the finished or the concept from a particular vantage point and gives you that sense of depth and three-dimension. Now, if you've taken art classes, you've learned about perspective, linear perspective, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because there's quite a lot to it, but you need to just be aware of it. And if you're going into a field like architecture that uses perspective a lot, then you'll spend much more time on that in your other studies. But artists around the Renaissance began to realize that what they were seeing, that as they analyzed what created depth and space, they noticed that parallel lines tend to converge as they recede. So they, just like a railroad track or a road going off into the distance, a straight road, the lines that run parallel tend to meet at some imaginary point on the horizon, which is called the vanishing point. Now, you can use linear perspective in a very formal way, like the painting that we just saw and this ink and color painting that's from Japan. There's a couple of things going on here. If you look at the lines on the floor, they're all angled at an angle that eventually causes those lines to meet out there on the horizon. And the artist is also using size and some of the other aerial perspective, some of the other techniques to establish a sense of depth in this painting. In one-point perspective, which was the first example that we saw of the city the city scene. All lines go to one point, which is one vanishing point on the horizon. You can put the horizon anywhere you want, and I'm sure you've all seen examples where the horizon was rather high in the picture plane, and we appeared to be lower down, gazing up. You've also seen the horizon line lower on the picture plane, which gives us more of an aerial view, that we're suspended up a little bit. Or you can put it exactly down the middle, as this one is almost exactly down the middle. And actually the horizon point is still at about a third down from the top. But you can look at this picture in your book and you can follow those parallel lines on the floor to that vanishing point in the distance. I should say that one-point perspective gives a rather formal look to a painting or drawing. Two-point perspective a little better reflects what we actually see as human beings with our two eyes. No objects are exactly parallel to the picture plane, and all the edges recede to two different points on the horizon line. Also developed during the Renaissance, it's a little more lifelike and natural, and we're not looking at things head-on, but more from an angle. So in this example, you can see a diagram on the bottom that's been superimposed over the example, the painting, and you could see that there's one vanishing point way off to the left, and there's another one at the very right edge of the picture plane. We don't see any flat surfaces, we see a lot of corners, and it looks a little more natural than the very first one we saw. You can also use multi-point perspective, where you get more than two vanishing points going. As illustrated here, that can lead to sort of a disorienting view for the viewer, where you're not quite sure where to focus, and it could be used very effectively. It's not used all that often, but just so you're aware of it, it's called multi-point. Amplified perspective is when you have an item that you're directly in front of and maybe appears a little heightened. And one of the examples in your book is the Uncle Sam drawing poster where he was pointing for the draft, and the finger was very, very large in comparison to the rest of the figure. And in this photograph, we have this unusual perspective. We're down low, kind of a bug's eye view, and the emphasis becomes more about the stems and the leaves than the flowers themselves, which is quite opposite of what our view normally is when we see something, a group of flowers like this. So it can be really effective to pull a viewer into the picture and shake up their assumptions. Then you can have multiple perspectives. These were used a lot in ancient art. This Egyptian piece shows. And it is just when you have figures that they're placed so that they wouldn't ever appear this way in real life. So you have figures that are shown to the side, but yet they'll have a front-facing head, and they use this just to show the most descriptive parts of the image, the object or image or person, and it wasn't really meant to reflect reality. In this one, you can see how the eye and the focal figure here is not the eye that you would see from the side. Today, we don't use multiple perspective as much unless you just want to play with perspective. And you can do that with conceptual art and montages where the idea or the shapes are much more important than any concept of realism or reality. And a few more here. Axonometric projection, parallel lines stay parallel. They don't recede to a vanishing point. Traditional Japanese wood blocks use this. We don't see it so much in the West, but sometimes you'll find it in engineering or mechanical drawing. And it gives you a sort of an optical illusion. We touched on this in your composition and you're creating a visual path. So you can create these open forms or closed forms in your compositions. This is an example of a closed form where the entire scene is captured within the picture plane. This keeps our attention inside the picture and might engage the viewer for a little longer. You can do this. I think I commented on some of your compositions. You can do this in so many different ways. The angles I suggested to a couple of you that you flip the grasses over horizontally so that the angle of the grasses was moving into the picture instead of out of the picture. If you had a fish that was swimming off the picture plane, I might have suggested that you again, flip that horizontally so that it was swimming back into the picture, or maybe just more of a circular around the picture frame. So usually when you look or you create a closed form, you usually create a little more of a complete scene. But that doesn't mean that an open form is bad. And you'll see open forms all the time, as illustrated here, where there's a lot going on off the picture plane. And this can create a more casual feeling. It might involve a unique point of view. And if this were an illustration for a shoe style that was being released, it'd be super effective because we know that there's a person attached to these shoes. We know that the shoe is in motion, but really everything that's happening here is all about the shoe. Transparency can be used to create a sense of depth. It can also confuse things just a little bit. So you see it here where it's been used, things are overlapping, but they're also transparent. So we're really not sure which objects are in the front and which are in the back. It doesn't give us such a clear picture as things that are opaque and overlapping. So it gives us a little more ambiguity and can create a little more visual interest. Or the term for this is equivocal space, purposeful ambiguity. You're unclear about what is where and what overlaps what. And a designer may be interested in using this. So that wraps up the illusion of space. Does anyone have anything to add on that? Then we'll just move right on. Oops, let me go back.
When you do the drop shadows on your on your graphics, that gives an illusion of space too, because it gives it a depth.
You're right. You're right. And that wasn't even brought up here, but especially in Photoshop, that can be a real key to establishing a sense of 3-dimension. The drop shadow, and also this often gets overlooked, but like a sense of impression. Like if you were to place a seashell onto a background of sand, you would not only want to have a shadow, but you would want to have a little bit of sand overlapping the bottom of the shell so that you gave this sense of it sitting
inside.
Yeah. So keep that in mind in your compositions. You want to really ground things.
Erase a little bit of the picture so that, like, that's what I did with the bus. I erased a little bit of the bus with a really with a brush that it was really soft, so it looked like in the sand a little bit more.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go on to motion, because sometimes we don't want static. We want things to have a little action going on. I love the illustration at the front of this chapter, which uses the the image of the scream in a car. I don't know who has the book and who doesn't have it, but it's pretty funny. Okay, so this picture looks pretty still. But in reality, if you think about it, there is some action here. The milk is pouring. If a line of milk indicates that there is action there. However, the picture taken as a whole looks very still. And so we can say that this exhibits a lot of relative stillness, but there is a tiny bit of motion here. How did they achieve that motion? Actually, in this one, the way they achieved motion was just by drawing on our innate knowledge that milk does not create a line of white unless it's flowing. So there's no technique used here except a direct line to the brain that says, there is something going on there. But in photography, once photographers started experimenting with shutter speeds and things like that, they were able to capture motion on a 2-dimensional surface. And artists started to think about what they were seeing in these photographs and how they could use that in their own artwork. And here we see a bullet captured as it goes through an apple. And so as we go through some of these ways of giving the illusion of motion, just think back to this photograph and how those things evolved from realizing what's happening in motion. When you're trying to create a sense of action, you want to create an anticipated moment or an anticipated movement or a tense space, they call it, as you can see in this baseball photo. So in order to convey motion, we have to ask the viewer to feel what it's like to have this motion. So that's called kinesthetic empathy. And that is when we, the viewer, recreate in our own bodies the actions we observe. So if you watch a tennis player swinging the racket, your brain and body are sort of imagining what that motion feels like. And sometimes you've all seen people who get very involved in a sports game and they're jumping and they're up and they're moving and they're their bodies are mimicking what's happening on the screen and in the game. So you can enhance this feeling. You can encourage this feeling by your viewers by using line and anticipation and what they call the tense space. And before we move on, the tense space in this photograph is that little bit of space between the runner's foot and the base, because we know, and there's another one between the ball and the mitt. And so those two spaces right there tell us that something is about to happen, and we don't know what's going to happen first, but there's very much a sense of implied motion going on. So here are the ways you can repeat the figure, you can crop a figure, you can employ blurred outlines and fast shapes, you can use multiple images, you can create lines of force, group multiple images, and employ optical movement. So we'll go through those really quickly. Everyone's seen the figure repeated. If you have ever read a comic strip, then you've seen that technique used. It's widely used in all types of art, and it usually creates a form of storyboard. So here we have a comic that goes through multiple, shows the figure multiple times, sometimes cropped in, sometimes different angles, and anyway, it's telling a story. You can also crop the figure. So in this one actually isn't really cropped, it's just cropped down to these two figures, but you can crop it so that the figure actually extends off the picture plane, and that implies that they're moving so fast that you weren't able to capture them. And then you can frame them as this one in a way that really enhances motion. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of diagonal lines. There's sort of an X formed by these two players. And there's also a sense of the player with the ball being a little bit off balance. So you know, your body knows that, your mind knows that he is moving forward. You can use blurred outlines and fast shapes. So when you are watching something that is moving fast, you lose the details and you lose the hard outlines. So here we have a dancer, and this is a series of photographs, a study in motion. And this is used in many, many art forms, including photography, line drawing or gesture drawing, graphic design, and industrial design. Here's an example of a cadzilla, the use of long sweeping motion lines to establish a sense of a fast moving object. These, you've probably seen these photographs, multiple exposures. So when you see one figure in an overlapping sequence of poses, then and animators do this, you get this sense of motion. And this is how animators create motion in their characters. And this is a multiple exposure, very famous. You see a lot of these where they have studied the muscle and the anatomy of different types of movements. You can use lines of force. In this Picasso or Duchamp, they're using different curved lines over and over to suggest this pathway of movement down the stairs. You can group a series of images together that creates a movement. They can be from the same source or not, as shown in this collage. You can use optical movement, employing things like after image. When you stare at something and an after image appears, if you look at this, if you can see it as clearly as I can on the screen, the dots are moving. As your eye moves around, so do the dots. And those are the ways you can create movement in your composition. So let's stop